But yeah, I mean, our innate frequency and attitude, like who we are on the core level, it's also actively determining our personal realm or sphere, whether we realize it or not. And something I've come to realize about this subject is that this means we tend to cross paths with people, opportunities, and situations that are a match for who we are, kind of resonating with our particular vibe. I even did a dedicated post on my Gab about this subject, I think in 2021 or 22, I don't know. But this sort of thing can also be orchestrated by higher stuff in terms of intervention, which ties into the whole destiny, fate, and higher incarnational life missions thing. But a really good example of this, like our frequencies resonating and making it so we either do or don't attract in people or situations. I had one that happened years ago in Charlottesville. It was in 2011. I had this job. I call it, to keep it anonymous, I call it my big cheese job because I work for big cheese people that are big and, in charge of stuff. And I'll just kind of say that and keep it anonymous. But so I was at this job and I had decided to go on break. It was my lunch. So I went up to the cafeteria as I always normally would. And the whole place was full, which is not normal. Like every table had people and there was nowhere to sit. And normally I would have gone out onto the pedestrian mall, which is downtown Charlottesville, to eat. But for some reason, I did something completely inexplicable that day. It was almost like I was a puppet being kind of guided by something else. So I remember standing in the cafeteria, looking around, all the tables are full. I looked out the window, contemplating the pedestrian mall, and then was just like, no, I'm just going to go back to my desk and not have my lunch, which I would never, ever normally do. Have never done that before that time. And I would never because I hated my job and I needed my lunch breaks. I needed that hour to get away and I would never forfeit it under normal circumstances. But it was, again, kind of almost like I was a puppet. So I just turned around and head right back down to the office where I worked and just sat back down at my desk. And my colleague, Terry, was next to me and she was looking at me all puzzled, like, why are you at your lunch? And I explained, oh, there was no place to sit in the lunchroom. And she was just kind of like, okay, this is weird. So I just am sitting at my desk, and within 5 minutes of me coming back and sitting down, almost like I was, again, like a puppet being controlled by something else, this guy walks into the office. It's an older man, and he was looking to see if our boss was available to speak with. And this guy's name was Al Slusser. And he had apparently just walked across the entire country, starting in San Diego. So he was doing a cross-country walk to bring awareness to senior citizen causes and things. So it just blew my mind. This guy had literally walked to Charlottesville from San Diego. And long story short, he was there to meet our boss, who wasn't in it at the time. I don't know where he was, but because we were there, we all started talking to him like, oh my God, like you just walked here? And this guy had the best vibe. He was almost like an angelic kind of a person, a really high vibed, good guy. And we just started talking to him. We're all just like, more and more of us, anyone who's coming into the office, gathering around and listening to his story about walking across the entire United States and what that was like. And then eventually, within like 10 minutes, our boss did come in. And it turns out he knew this guy was supposed to be showing up, but he forgot to tell us. So he knew, and he was just late coming back, and it totally slipped his mind to even mention it to us. But my point is that you can see what had to happen. Like, it was a very unusual circumstance, and I felt like I was being controlled like a puppet so that I would be there when this guy came into it was 5 minutes away, and I had, something made me come back. But I feel like, to me, that's an example of your vibe having to be a match for somebody, because I've also had the opposite, where I have gotten up and walked away or just not been in a particular moment in space time when something very negative was about to take place, like a really negative person. And it's like, reality makes sure it's because our vibes are so different. We don't even cross paths, And Al Slusser is a good example of when, you do cross paths with something that is like also a positive thing, a positive match for you. So yeah, when, you're not a frequency match for something, it's like you can't even, they can't even seem to exist in your personal sphere or reality, and you won't even cross paths with them. It's like almost like ships passing in the night. And I have multiple experiences with this. And a good example would be like me and famous people in general. Now, I've lived in Southern California for 10 years and in South Orange County, also spent a lot of time in LA. And it was, there's a lot of opportunity for me to have crossed paths with some famous people. And it was like a lot of the people around me were always crossing paths with famous people. But with me, it never seemed to happen. It's like I could not ever seem to be in the same physical space as these people, unless they were like me in some way. And I have an example of that I'm going to get back to. But like a good example of famous, like, back in 2000, I had a job at a really high-end real estate agency in South Orange County. And one of the real estate agents who worked there, she was already like D-level famous, like holdovers famous from her heyday in the 80s. But now she was a real estate agent, had a complete career change. But she was already pseudo famous, but she was never hardly there in the office. And there was only one time where I managed to actually be in the same room as her, but it was like we were across on opposite ends of the room. So I'm just looking at her from across the room, and I knew who she was due to her career and everything. And then within like 2 years of that, she went on to be on The Real Housewives of Orange County, like one of the original people, like one of the original OGs of The Real Housewives of Orange County. So anyone who knows the Real Housewives stuff, especially of Orange County, you're going to know who this lady is. And I actually worked at the same place as her at the same time during a 6-month window, and was in the room with her. But it was like, that was the closest I could ever get. It was one time in 6 months and far opposite ends of the room. And I kind of had already noticed this pattern when it came to me and famous people. Like, I can't even basically be in the same room as them. And the reason being is because our frequencies are so opposite. It's like, whereas I'm trying to, like, mostly in my life, be low key and invisible and hiding, and I don't want people looking at me, and I get self-conscious, and I'm kind of the introverted extrovert as an INFJ. And my goals in life, have been, I want to help people, and I'm doing my website, and I do a lot of personal charity work, and just kind of living a very low key life that's kind of STO oriented. Famous people are very STS oriented and much of the time, really like raging narcissists, attention whores. They want to be seen. They're very thirsty for fame and money and attention, and they will do anything to get to the top. They're clawing their way to the top, and they will step on anybody that they have to get there, and burn as many bridges, in order to get the fame and the money. And it's just such a complete opposite vibe of me that I've noticed. It's like I can't even cross paths with these people. It's so opposite, but unless they're like me. And I had another example where this was in Charlottesville, and I was working at a hotel front desk job at I'll keep it anonymous. I've nicknamed it the Illuminati Hotel in my writing. So anyone who's read my website, be familiar with that. But the Charlottesville was hosting the book festival. It was an annual book festival. And so the hotel had famous authors that were staying there. And I had my one moment where I got to check in a famous author, and literally this guy is standing right in front of me. So we are able to interact, like our realms are connecting. I'm checking this guy in, and I didn't even know who he was. Like, when I checked him in, I had no idea. I didn't even know he was an author. I had no idea. And I had to look him up when I was done checking him in. I jumped on the internet and I typed in his name. And I was like, oh my God, like, he was a major famous author who he had like 3 of his books had been turned into major A-list movies, starring people like Tom Hanks and Sandra Bullock and things like that. So very, very big movies were made from his books. But his personality was very quiet, low key, introverted, like bookish, nerdy, very humble. Like, he was nothing like a famous person. Like, you would never know this guy was famous. So he acted like a completely normal, humble, low-key, introverted, quiet, respectful, nice guy. And therefore, in my opinion, my realm could intersect with his, like, because he's like me. He's not like a normal famous person who's very STS and narcissistic. So that's just a good example of that. Another recent one, the last job that I just had, that I left a couple of months ago. It was for it was firearms accessories was the industry, and it's here in South Florida. Just kind of keep it anonymous, but the CEO at that job, who's technically my boss, not my immediate boss, but he's the CEO, not a nice guy. I'm going to keep it very vague in general. Not a nice guy at all. Like, no joke. People have called this guy the devil, Satan. It's no joke. Like, this guy, it's not good. And I did not know that when I first took the job. I didn't even know who this guy was. I only found out like some things about him like a month or so into the job. You know, I learned some things on the internet, like interviews he'd given, and it was kind of shocking. I was like, oh my God. But, you know, long story short, in the 7 months I was at this job before I finally left, I barely crossed paths with this guy who, by the way, for no reason, he didn't seem to like me at all. So the few times I did have to interact with him, and everyone would be like, oh, that's just the way he is. Don't take it personal. He can be really nasty. And I'm like, yeah, sure. But I do really think there was a lot more going on with that than just, oh, you know, he's just a nasty person to everybody, which he could be definitely. But like it was to the point where he couldn't even look me in the eye. So if you try to look him in the eye, it's almost like he would wince, you know, like flinch. And he could not maintain eye contact with me. And in the 7 months I was there, I'm up at the front, and it was like even when he's in the office, I never saw him. He's just always somehow at the other end of the office, and we never crossed paths with each other. And not even I didn't even see him come or go through the front door. So I'm like, how does this guy even getting in and out of the building? That's how much we're not crossing paths. So our vibes were just so completely different that even though we're under the same roof together, I barely ever interact with this dude ever, even when he's in the office all day, never actually really see him. We just always seem to never be in the same room together. We don't ever cross paths in the office. It's the weirdest thing. And then I finally left, but I really think it's no joke. There was a thing going on with that, with the whole personal frequency thing that kept us apart because we were just so completely different in who we were at the core level and our motivations. Another thing that can happen with relating to, you know, your personal frequency and whether or not you're a match for something is that you can also miss out on opportunities or particular happenings. So it's not even just that, you know, you won't cross paths with certain people or you will cross paths with certain people. It's actual life happenings, you know, will or won't come your way. And you know, we've already kind of touched on this a few times since we started talking. But a really good example would be my brother Joe. I've talked about him a lot on my website. And the way in which, since he was a child, you know, he was a magnet for the weird and the woo, like literal, like paranormal phenomenon since he was a toddler. And I was not ever. And why? It was like because he was a match for it, even going back into being a toddler and being that young. It was like almost like he was never really fully grounded in this reality, even as a kid. And so maybe not so coincidentally, he found himself surrounded by paranormal happenings in life. And that just it kept going and going, extending all the way into his teen years. So as a result, he was constantly finding himself in bizarre situations and being witness to things that people don't normally just stumble onto, because that was his frequency, just kind of not grounded. It's like something's loosey-goosey there, and he's really open to it. And meanwhile, I was not. My personality and vibe was very grounded, kind of fixed in place, and actually full of fear about a lot of things in general when I was young. And then later on, you know, I lived in the paranormally polluted apartment, which I jokingly called the Vortex, and I have a whole huge write-up about it on my website, when me and Joe were roommates in that apartment, which I mentioned earlier when I mentioned it when we were moving. I was breaking up with Steve. We moved out. And me and Joe were roommates in an apartment. That apartment became the Vortex. And I was kind of trapped there with no money and no car. And there was just tons of paranormal stuff happening all the time. So it was almost like going through an initiation that's forcing me to get used to dealing with paranormal and learning how to face it head on, learning about what it is, how it works, and what I can do to ward it off and everything. So, but that's a whole kind of like a side topic. But I mean, so there I am in life. I'm very fixed and fearful and very grounded, the opposite of Joe, until the Vortex happened. But, but that leads to the important point is that I never naturally stumbled onto anything weird or third density conspiracy on my own the way Joe consistently did. So any weirdness that came into my life was solely because Joe brought it in. I mean, including the vortex. And he brought me directly to the weirdness, so to speak. So like I had an incident where I got to witness real UFOs in Portland, but that was only because Joe comes running into the apartment and brings it to my attention and just finally convinces me to come outside and come see the UFOs. Otherwise, I never would have known they were happening. I'm inside and I'm oblivious. But once again, Joe's always in the right place at the right time to be witnessing weird stuff constantly. He was constant with him. It was almost mind numbing. That's how often it was happening with him, but not with me unless I was associated with him. So it's a good point that just some people, because of who they are in a frequency core level, they're just magnets for certain happenings that will cross their paths, and for other people, they won't. And even though me and Joe are related, we're siblings, we live under the same roof together, we couldn't have been more opposite in terms of the way we were wired. So we had two very different realities going on because of who we were on the core level and our personal frequencies.
As you talked about, normally, if you've got a very different mindset or vibe from someone else, you're not really going to cross paths with them in a meaningful, prolonged way. And so therefore, it's just going to keep you apart. It's like north and north poles of a magnet repelling. It just kind of keeps you apart on a probabilistic level. But if you're forced to be with someone of a different vibe for long enough, then there seems to be some sort of a bleed over or a crossover. I mean, because after all, you are sharing the same space. So therefore, you're sharing the same experiences.
Right. And I actually likened it it's like catching a cold. Like when having Joe in my reality, like under the same roof for so long, side by side with the very, very different reality that he had going on. It was like I eventually caught it myself. I kind of had no choice. It's kind of like catching a cold. So that also included the phenomenon where he had number sightings, something I'd never even really heard of until him. So he's had these same repeating numbers that seem to follow him around everywhere in life. And for him, one of them was 141. And I talk about this all over my website. But until Joe, I never had that. Like, there's no 141. But all of a sudden, after having Joe in my life and him talking about it all the time, I caught it like with a vengeance. 141 became my number, and it's on my website. People who know my website know about that. And for years and years, 141 was in my life on a regular basis. Never existed until Joe. Being under the same roof day in and day out, like catching a virus or something.
Yeah. So these people with their own personal energy fields, I mean, they are essentially inflating or helping to project and shape their personal reality bubble. And when your bubble and their bubble kind of gets too close together for long enough, they start to merge. I noticed, like, for myself, I get the 141 too as well.
Yeah, it was like you caught it from me, and then I felt bad.
Right, I caught it from you, and then 137 was another guy's number that I knew online.
And then I caught it from you. Like, you caught it from him, because he was always talking about it to you. You got it, and then I'm always hearing you talk about it, and then I got it. And then so 137 became a very valid thing in my reality.
Yeah, except for it wasn't strictly psychological, because I started getting to 137 synchronicities, and he would have his, and I would get mine. But I determined that the meaning that I got it for was not the same as his meaning.
Right. Like but my meaning was the same as yours.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so for his meaning, it was more like a symbol of, I don't know, like the magic of reality. Because 137, it's like you got the fine structure constant in physics, which is 1 over 137. You got the idea of like a white beam of light, which is like 1, hitting a triangular prism, which is 3, splitting into 7 colors, that's 137. You got the rainbow, related to that. You got the rainbow. The angle that the rainbow makes from one side to the other depends on how light refracts within water, and that is essentially 136.9 or something like degrees, 137 essentially. So 137, it appears throughout creation. So for him, it was like the magic of creation, whereas for me, 137 ended up meaning like disillusionment with some sort of physical trial or attempt or experiment or something. Like anything I'm attempting, like buying something online, or I need to go to the store to see if they have a particular item, or something breaking, like Mercury retrograde type things.
Yeah, like physical efforts not panning out would be a good way of summarizing it. Like your efforts to make this happen in mundane, everyday, third density life, it's not going to work out. like, and sometimes it's because there's interference, like some, bad elements in the works, and it like almost again like a Mercury retrograde type of thing. And that's how it became that for me as well.
Yeah.
So same meaning.
Yeah, and one time I did try to make my own synchronistic number. I picked the number 353 because you can see that on a clock, so it should be probable, just as probable as any other number on a clock. So I tried to create that number and imbue it with a certain meaning, charge it up. And okay, it happened a little bit, but I don't get it anymore. So me trying to create something wasn't as powerful as something that already pre-existed. Which tells me that synchronistic numbers, in many ways, they do act like thought forms, in the sense that they are constructs within the etheric plane, possibly even within the astral plane, that have their own archetypal identity. I mean, they're numbers. A number is an archetype. Every single number is an archetype. 1's an archetype, 2's an archetype, 3's an archetype. So these numbers, they're archetypes that are associated with certain meanings on a collective consciousness level. The same with dream symbols, right? I mean, we all have dreams of being naked in public, or dirty toilets, or teeth falling out, or whatever. And when you look these up in dream symbol books, they'll tell you what the meaning is, and it'll generally be true for everyone. I mean, we also have our own personalized synchronistic numbers and meanings, but there is like a collective consciousness or subconscious that has these archetypes within them, and these numbers seem to be associated with that, and therefore it can sort of transfer from one person to another, because what they're tapped into, their frequency spectrum kind of catches to yours, and now you're tapped into that part of the collective subconscious that has that particular archetype. But it filters through your own energy field, your own psyche, so therefore the meaning might be related, but not exactly the same. So 1111, for a lot of people, it means being in the flow, but for someone else, it might mean something slightly different. Or 141, for you and for me, might be different from when someone else gets it. And I've had people email me saying that they get the number 141, even though I never mentioned it and they never read your stuff.
Wow.
So they get it too, or 137. But for them, sometimes it means the same thing, and sometimes it doesn't. But even when it doesn't, on a very deep core archetypal level, there is still a relation. It's just like a variation of the archetype into a different symbol versus, being a completely different archetype. So I think that does speak, once again, to our reality being a collective co-creation, in a sense, almost like a collective dream world. Because just as we get symbols in dreams, just as we get very odd synchronistic connections in dreams between, I had a dream of a fire truck, and then later I had a dream of a crane falling down. Okay, you look those two things up in a dream symbol book, I mean, just for illustration, and they might have the same exact meaning, but they're just expressed in two different symbols. But subconsciously, they're both expressions of the very same thing. And if you want to think about it in terms of quantum physics, when you're in the presence of someone else who has a totally different vibe that you normally wouldn't cross paths with, if you interact with them enough, that's what in quantum physics they would call entanglement. And in physics, they only talk about entanglement between two photons or two electrons. And that's where once those two things interact with each other and they become entangled, then when you separate them, even if you separate them like a light year apart, their behaviors then will become correlated. So it's almost like they're kind of connected at this higher level, and their behaviors start becoming more and more correlated. And so when, for example, you and I were to interact and entangle more and more with each other, it's no longer just one electron, it's no longer just one photon, it's countless trillions and quadrillions of particles that are entangling through our interaction, right? Including the particles in your brain and in my brain. Now, if the entanglement were strong enough, then we would have telepathy, but as humans, it's not strong enough, so we don't get telepathy, but we might get common synchronicities. We might start getting common thought patterns, like if you're a very happy, positive person, it might rub off on me, and I might start getting uplifted. Or if you're very depressed, it might rub off on me. And so I think those things are examples of quantum entanglement happening on a larger biological scale. But in terms of metaphysics and New Age, we would just call it, your vibes are just rubbing off on me. See, that's how we describe it in an experiential sense. But I do think that at a physics level, it's exactly the same thing. I think it's a more complicated, macroscopic, collective form of entanglement that's happening. And that also applies to probability of experiences. Like in your case with Joe, from a very young child, he was already getting all these paranormal experiences, right? And you mentioned how his consciousness wasn't fully grounded in reality.
Yeah, he was just like out of it and kind of like, it's hard to describe.
Yeah, like his psyche was on the fringes of what's considered normal consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was kind of like tuned into a weird station.
And part of it was also he had some head injuries as a baby, and including a frontal lobe injury. So that's also, especially the frontal lobe thing, it creates a host of problems that can lead to sociopathy, which he had definitely as he got older. But it's that lack of fear and lack of inhibition, the need to always be doing dangerous things to stimulate yourself because there is that lack of fear. But I think the neocortex, whatever, frontal lobe injury, it releases that inhibition and repression that I definitely had. I have very tightly wound as a kid, you know. He just wasn't. He's just la la la, just whoa. And part of it, I think, has to do with the brain injury, kind of frees up the inhibition. But then once you're freed up from that, then it starts going into, on a metaphysical level, he was just open. He was just wide. And there might have been other things going on too besides the head injury. There could have been just something different about him metaphysically than there was with me, something different spiritually, I don't know. But yes, since he was a toddler, he was bringing in paranormal harassment, like literally being harassed his entire childhood. This stuff kept coming to him and going around him, and it was terrifying to him as a kid. But he was also open and more loosey-goosey, whereas I was desperately trying to shut out anything that would scare me, just put up walls and block it out, and very rigidly fixed in place compared to him. So he was more kind of go with the flow in a lot of ways in general.
Right, so it wasn't until you had lived with him for a period of time, like forced to live with him for a period of time, that...
Yeah, once he was full-fledged in this crazy state as a teen, like he's fully coming into himself, embracing his paranormal stuff and being a full-fledged sociopath, uninhibited, just kind of fully embracing a lot of dark stuff, you know. And now I'm living under the same roof. And I was living under the same roof with him, in case people were wondering. I was trying to rescue him. I'm trying to save him. So it's like trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So like I'll have him come live with me. You know, I'll help take care of him until he gets on his feet, and then he can be, you know, get a job, and then he'll be okay in life. And of course, it didn't go that way at all. It completely blew up in my face. The more I tried to help him, the worse it got. But that's a whole side subject. But that's why we were roommates. I was trying to help him and save him and rescue him and get him back on track in life. And he was too far gone. It was ridiculous. And he was fully embracing this dark stuff, you know, like the paranormal stuff, and being kind of sociopathic and all that. So, and not being grounded, just really like being loosey-goosey and embracing the weird, like in a way that's not normal for people. Just completely fully believing that, and he might have been right, and we're going to touch on this later, that he did not believe that this was real, that this place, it is not real. And partly he was being told that during his abductions as well, but he had his own bizarre experiences, just bizarre, that were showing him. And I would later have a lot of my own really weird experiences too, not quite to the level that he did, but some really far out stuff that's really pointing towards the idea that this reality is not real. But he was already fully embracing that when I was roommating with him, that this place is not real. And so he was operating, truly believing this isn't real. None of this is real. I'm not real. You're not real. None of this is really happening the way we think it is. Like really believing it's some kind of like a matrix type of artificial program that we're in. So yeah, he fully embraced that.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly there are plenty of people out there who have bizarre experiences. And every single one of them is a counterexample to the idea of the pseudo-skeptics who say that reality is merely what physics and science and, you know, the mainstream tells us it is. And of course, the fallacy that they make is that, well, my life is ordinary. I've never seen a ghost. I've never seen an alien. I've never had a single synchronicity. I'm just a boring NPC puppet.
Right. It's just like what I was talking about earlier, like those people, almost like gatekeepers trying to keep people from believing in any of this stuff.
Right.
And keep them locked into a very limited state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of the absence of something. So they are living within a subset reality, and some people are living in a superset reality.
Yeah.
And that includes more weird things. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on is you mentioned how Joe, since an early child, you know, he had a brain injury, mm-hmm. right? So his brain was screwed up, and it gave him sociopathic tendencies. Yeah. Because it was some sort of frontal lobe injury, it sounds like. Yeah. So prefrontal cortex or something.
Yep.
That, and I've gotten emails from people who mention how when they were, let's say, on mushrooms, you know, some sort of mind-altering substance, physical reality itself started getting really weird for them, and others were there to verify it. Like they started getting very weird synchronicities, glitches, matrix mm-hmm. glitches, because their mind wasn't synchronized with reality properly.
Right. Okay, you're articulating what I was trying to earlier, and I couldn't really do it well. That's perfect. Yes, that's. I was trying to say like something that happened to his brain ended up translating in a metaphysical way, but I couldn't articulate it very well.
Yeah, and there's many ways to explain it. Like earlier when I talked about how your personal reactivity profile, like how you react to situations, how that then interacts with different probable future feedback flows. Well, I mean, obviously, if you get a brain injury, your whole entire probable future spectrum is going to shift because now you're not going to have access to those probable futures where you've got a normal brain, right? So your feedback flow from the future is going to be different now. So maybe some of those futures involve negative forces that want to take advantage of your sociopathic state. And they're not going to select someone who's got a normal brain with normal conscience and normal empathy, right? They're going to select someone who has a lack of that. And so he's got the brain injury, so that opens him up to certain things that other people are not open up to.
Right.
These entities are looking for inroads into that. Yeah, so like, or in my case, the anecdote I've told a bunch of times on different interviews, like where I went to Walgreens while having a really bad oral migraine. Oral migraine just means that you've got a migraine, you're in your field of vision, you've got this flashing stuff that's around your peripheral vision.
So you mean oral, like AURAL?
Yeah.
Oral.
Yeah, oral as in like an aura.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a visual aura. They call it an aura. So I was getting that, probably brought on by magnesium deficiency. I didn't realize it at the time. But anyway, so I was driving to your place, but I had this really bad oral migraine going on, and I had to get to your place as fast as possible. But I had to stop by Walgreens to get like Advil or something to take care of it. So when I was in there, the aisle that I needed was blocked by two guys and a cashier woman, and they all had carts, so the carts were blocking the aisle, they were blocking the aisle. And normally, what I would normally do is go another aisle, go all the way to the back, and then come back from the other side, because that's a polite thing to do, right? I'm not an asshole. So, but because I was in this state where I was like, I don't freaking care. I need to get there. I'm not going to go all the way around. And I tried to go through them, and they didn't see me.
Yeah.
They didn't see me. I'm like, I tried to tell them like, hey, excuse me. They didn't stop talking. They kept on looking at each other. Okay, I started pulling the carts out of the way, trying to squeeze my way through them. They didn't react. Eventually, I got tangled up in one guy's arms, like literally. Like his hand was on the cart, trying to move the cart. I was trying to go through him. His arm was in the way. I picked up his bare-skinned arm, and I moved it out of the way, slapped it onto another cart. He didn't change. He kept on talking. None of them like looked at each other funny or stopped talking or anything like that. They're like animatronic puppets.
Yeah.
But they were warm. They weren't like puppets. They were warm. They were living, but they weren't conscious of me even when I moved their arm. So eventually I got through and I got my stuff. And then when I was going back the other way, they weren't there anymore. But that was weird because my brain was fritzing out. That's what an oral migraine is. It's a minor epileptic seizure in your occipital lobe, which is your visual centers.
Right.
So my brain was electrically funny, and I did something that was highly improbable. So it seems to me almost as if this is like a matrix computer program that monitors your brainwaves, your consciousness, to predict what you're going to do next in order to arrange reality around you to anticipate that. And actually, a lot of massive online multiplayer games nowadays, they do that where they try to anticipate a player's moves in order to render something before they get there so that everything's nice and smooth, right? But if the player like jerks a mouse all of a sudden, then the game can't catch up and you get this weird rubber banding lag effect, where things have to snap back into place.
That's the stuff Joe figured out. Like, again, keep in mind, he had a lifetime problem with his brain. So he's already just always in a state where he's functioning differently from people. And he became like, where of course he doesn't believe this is real. So now he wants to always be messing with the game. So his whole thing became about do unpredictable, crazy things and just watch reality get really wonky. So yeah, what happened to you is like the kind of state that Joe is in all the time. And some of the experiences that he had, which I was alluding to earlier, that I said were really far out there in terms of showing that this place isn't real. It involved people that were acting like he wasn't there. And he came home one day, he was freaking the frick out, like, because he had a thing that happened at work where it was like, he was like, I could do anything I wanted, Carissa. You don't understand. I could do anything I wanted. It was like I wasn't there, or like they weren't there. I don't even know. But it was like, it's like, this isn't real. Like, and so he was like getting up in people's faces and like gesturing in their face and doing all this stuff. And it was like they couldn't see him. And it's like they're not even phased in the same reality. And so he was kind of like losing his mind about it. Like, what is this show us about reality. Like, so he was having those kind of experiences all the time, you know, and that's what I mean by like what I was saying earlier, stuff that, and he interpreted it like this whole place isn't real, but it might be more along what you're trying to say, you know, your
Yeah.
explanation might be more accurate.
Yeah, but it kind of does bring up the possibility. Well, if you can do these things inadvertently through, like in my case, an oral migraine, or in his case, a head injury, what if you could do it intentionally?
Right.
What if you could control your own brain waves, your own consciousness, you know, the energies that you're projecting? Could you then be invisible to others? Could you have an entire civilization that practices this? And that's what aliens are, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they could be physical beings, they could be around us, they could be abducting people, but everyone around them isn't aware of it because it's not synchronizing with their personal reality bubble. Actually, someone kind of proposed this theory to me once. She said that it seems to her like when you're interacting with someone, you're sending out waves of energy, like energy data packets, and it pings them, and it pings their subconscious or their higher self, or you know, whatever other part of their psyche, and through that connection, then they ping you, and that's how you form a connection. It's like dialing a phone call. So now you're both in the same reality. You're interacting with each other completely physically, right? But what if you're around them and you don't send that ping signal? Then they don't ever connect. And so therefore you're not in the reality, even though you are in their reality, like to you. And that's why, you know, you are invisible. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a whole field of study, I guess it's part of the Fortean phenomenon, Fortean, Fortean phenomenon, of spontaneous human invisibility. People that are at parties, and for whatever reason, they just go invisible. Like, they go into a bathroom, they come out, and all of a sudden no one can see them for the next 45 minutes. You know, they can wave their hands in front of the persons, and actually they can probably even physically interact with them, but the person isn't conscious of it. So it's not just visual invisibility, it's like conscious invisibility, which is what I experienced at Walgreens with those people in the aisle.
Yeah.
I was messing with them and they weren't even conscious of it. What the heck is going on there?
Glitch in the matrix.
Yeah, pretty much. Oh, or you know, or maybe it's possible that the people at the party and the person that went to the bathroom, they diverged timelines temporarily. Mm-hmm. So now one person is in a timeline where the rest of the people are NPCs, you know, just like stand and fill in characters on that timeline, because he's the only soul in that temporary timeline, and none of the other bodies there have souls in them because they're just temporary placeholders. And then in the other timeline, I don't know, maybe he's the NPC there. So maybe he never came out of the bathroom, or who knows what. But yeah, people report like, oh yeah. And then when the timelines finally merge, now they're synchronized again. And then the people report like, yeah, we were looking for you for like 45 minutes. We didn't know where you were.
Right.
Like maybe he was there, but you know, they couldn't consciously perceive him, or vice versa. I don't know. It's a mind pretzel to try to think about.
Yeah, and I had just related. I had an experience where I was living in the vortex, and I talked about this in the vortex, where I was on my computer doing my writing, and I was really focused on my writing, and all of a sudden I realized that the sounds of the outside world through my open window were just getting like louder and louder and louder and louder, like just, and I'm frowning at my computer, like trying to focus, as like everything that could possibly be making noise outside my window was starting to make noise. So like car alarms going off, fire engines screaming down Santa Margarita Parkway, dogs barking, little kids right outside my window on the ground. I was on the second story, just screaming, parents screaming for the kids, and more dogs and more sirens and car alarms and just everything that could be making noise. But, you know, I'm sitting there like frowning at my computer, but also focusing in on the noise. And I didn't even understand why until later when I was telling Joe about what happened. I'm like, oh yeah, this really weird thing happened earlier, because Joe was out when it happened. Then he came home and I was telling him about it. And as he's listening, he already knew before I even finished like what I was going to say, because I realized that as I was explaining to him why, despite everything being as loud as it was I frowning and focusing in intently. And it's like, yeah, because nothing that they said made any sense. And then, I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he said because there was some colorful language in there. But yeah, like nothing that they were saying was making sense. So it was like, yeah, these people are screaming and all these voices, but it was garbled. There was no clear words. I couldn't understand a word that was being said. So that's why I'm frowning and focusing in unconsciously without even realizing at the time what was going on. So I'm like trying to understand. I can't understand a single thing anyone's even saying. And then as soon as I started giving it my full attention and frowning and trying to like focus in and understand anything, even a single word of what's being said, all of a sudden reality just went back to normal. The level of volume went back down. Like there was like a literal volume button, and someone turned it back down to the normal level of volume. So it's no longer every single source of noise in the vicinity that could possibly be making noise. And the words started making sense again. So it was like for a moment in time, I was completely desynchronized or something. And that's what Joe described it, as being like, he even saw it that way, as being like almost like phased out of reality. So, you're not phased in all the way. It's almost like taking a contact lens and putting it on your eye, but it's not in the correct position. So everything's blurry, but then you kind of get it situated on your eyeball the correct way. And now you can see. So it was like I was phased out for some reason, phased out of reality. And so I don't know. I don't know what was going on.
Well, it seems to me possibly that when we talk about phasing in or phasing out of reality, that what the aliens can do where they are literally invisible, like optically invisible even to a camera, where they can walk through walls or, detach themselves from gravity, that might just be a more extreme form of the same phasing that you're talking about. Like, what if you phase only very slightly? So now you're phasing out of your current linear timeline 3D trajectory now you're starting to wander into less probable timelines. So now reality is starting to fray at the edges. So you're not fully out of reality yet. You're not out of physicality. You still got gravity. You still got a solid chair you're sitting on. So solidity still works, but probability is starting to get weird.
Yeah. And Joe was saying that the reason he recognized what I was saying is because he was like, yeah, it happens to me all the time. Like, he's basically like, welcome to my reality. Like, he's apparently phased out a lot of the time, and all these things were happening, like these kind of glitchy phasing out where he's not fully here or there, and then weirdness would happen. And then that led to some really far out experiences that I haven't even touched on yet. But but yeah, I mean, it's matching exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now we can experience this in far more milder, more plausible ways too. Those are pretty extreme examples where reality literally starts breaking down.
Yeah.
It's like,
and most people won't ever experience that. And that was my one time where I experienced that, because like I said, I was pretty grounded and fixed in place, and these sort of things didn't happen to me, despite me being his full-blooded sibling. We couldn't have been on different reality planes. We were just always so different.
Mm-hmm. But like on a more mundane level, for example, if like I'm very preoccupied with something really worldly and mundane for a few days, like for example, I got a computer problem here and I need to focus on that. So I'm like preoccupied with trying to fix a stupid operating system issue for like 3 days. Funny enough, for those 3 days, it's almost like I get radio silence from the rest of the world. Like no emails, no instant messages, barely any comments on social media. It's like I dropped out from the rest of the world and they dropped out from mine, and there really is no interaction because all my energy is focused on this little tiny stupid problem, and therefore it's not pinging or connecting with the rest of the world out there. That's one example. Or conversely, if I'm really deep into something like physics or alchemy, funny enough, I'll get emails from other physics and alchemy seekers or people asking about that subject about a week or two. Right now, I have not been in the physics mode for maybe 3 months, 2-3 months. And during the past 2 months, I have not been really getting any physics emails from anyone. But I swear to you, if I were to start researching that, today.
It happens all the time with you. I know. As soon as you start focusing on a certain subject, you'll, if you start focusing on the stuff that's on your website, you'll start getting emails, or if the physics stuff, you'll start hearing from people about physics.
Right.
Happens to you all the time.
Right. And it's not confirmation bias, because I could scroll through my inbox right now and it's not like I'm getting physics emails every day and I'm just ignoring them because I'm not paying attention to it. No, there's been none. And then if I were to really get focused on it for a couple days, I would get it.
Yeah, and I've had that too, where I go for very long periods of time. I don't even think about my website, so I'll go months. I don't get a single email. But if I start putting my attention back on the subjects of my website and even thinking about writing something for my website, or I'm tinkering with existing articles and editing them and I'll get emails. All of a sudden, it's like I'm back on the grid again, and like I'm back on the radar, and I'm able to connect with those people, and I'll get an email or two or whatever. Yep. Absolutely. I get the same thing, just not as much as you do.
Yeah, or like if my vibe were to drop for a week or more, then I'll stop hearing from all the high-vibed people that I normally hear from, and instead I'll start hearing from other people that are lower vibed, which I haven't heard from a long time back when I was still in a higher vibe.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like I'm dialing between different radio or TV stations and pulling in one set of people here and then one set of people over there, depending on which mode I'm in. So funny enough, I can use that as a gauge now. Like if I don't hear from the high vibe people for a while, then I sort of do a reality check on my own vibes, trying to think like, okay, am I really in a lower state and I just haven't noticed it? Because, you know, you can descend in your vibe over a couple weeks without even really knowing it because it's so gradual.
Yeah.
Right. It's so gradual. It's like that whole frog boiling metaphor. You know, it's boiled so slowly, it doesn't have time to jump out because it never realizes it's getting so hot. It can decline like that, but there are certain indicators that you can use to figure out when your vibes have indeed changed. And they're the ones like, you know, certain interests that you have, certain problems that you run into, certain people that are, you know, coming back into your life. Those are general indicators that you can have whether you're in one state or another state.
Yeah.
Now, your own subconscious resistance, it can also work against manifesting. Because just now I was talking about how when you switch from one vibe to another, all of a sudden you don't hear from those high vibe people anymore. Well, the same thing happens with opportunities. Like if you're trying to, or if you're just hoping, or you're just potentially exposing yourself to positive opportunities in life. If you don't have the right vibe for that, you're going to end up repelling it. But then the question is, well, what does it mean to not have the right vibe? Well, to not have the right vibe means your subconscious patterns are no longer conducive for resonating with that, for interacting it, energizing that temporal feedback loop and pulling it into physical manifested reality. And subconscious resistance is a big part of that. And one way that you can detect this is you have this inner knowing that this is wrong or that it's not a good idea. So like if on an ego superficial level, you want something, a particular job, particular opportunity, you know, whatever. But subconsciously, you just know that it's just wrong. It's just not a good idea. That's going to work against you, probably for the better, you know, because that subconscious resistance, in some cases, it can be your own intuition. It can be your own higher self. It could be some guardian spirit that's kind of overlooking, you know, when it knows that you're going to go down a dangerous path. So it's like screaming no in your ear. Mm-hmm. And if you're not that psychic, you know, you'll probably just feel it as a slight intuition, like, yeah, I probably shouldn't be doing that. Or subconscious resistance can be artificially induced through negative programming, whether like childhood trauma, abandonment issues, alienation, you know, different rejection experiences, or growing up in poverty and being conditioned to always be conserving and never really living life to the fullest. All these things can get ingrained in your psyche, right? And this is something I touched on earlier, but it bears repeating over and over again because this is really the core. There's so much in our past that has programmed us that has built up momentum that's pushing us in a certain direction. And so that is the general direction that our life takes, whether or not we, on a more superficial conscious level, want that or not. So, like I said earlier, you know, you can try to counter that giant momentum by doing these little manifestation rituals, you know, trying to reprogram yourself. But if so much of that is superficial without addressing the deeper issues, then you're just kind of stepping on the gas while having the brakes on at the same time. You know, your car's going to go, but it's going to create friction, and eventually your engine's going to catch fire or your brakes are going to catch fire. You're going to invite these side effects that you didn't intend for originally. Things are going to start backfiring because despite your good intentions, there's a deeper pollution underneath within your psyche that's corrupting the outcome. You know, it's kind of like there's seeds of darkness that have been planted in addition to whatever positive seeds of flowers that you've planted, and they're going to grow together, right? So you're going to get this beautiful flower garden with a bunch of thorns that are going to cut you up if you try to go in there. That's how it tends to work out. And if you try to bypass some of these subconscious higher self safety measures too much, like for example, you know, you've got your conscience, you've got your higher self, you got potentially positive guardian spirits, like I mentioned, trying to help you out, trying to keep you from the dangerous avenues. If you treat that as just mere resistance that's getting in the way of your ego's desires, then you can definitely use, you know, rituals to get that anyway. Mm-hmm. You know, so you're kind of bypassing the safety measures. And that is pretty much the definition of black magic.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're trying to warp reality using your will against your better good, against the better good of others, and for the sake of your shadow or your ego. Mm-hmm. Right? And you're purposely trying to bypass divine laws that are meant for your good and for everyone else's good. So that's where it gets into black magic territory. And that's why even in the New Age field, which always talks about love and light, there can actually be a lot of darkness there.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because a lot of people there are driven by desperation, by ego, bitterness, but then they cloak that with this smile, this fake smile of love and light. visualizing the purple flame of Saint Germain, right?
Yeah.
And all this stupid stuff. But that's why they always end up so cranky, right? despite the yoga, despite the balancing stones and candles.
Despite the veganism.
Yeah, despite everything, they end up cranky. These miserable American New Age or middle-aged people.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I don't think I'm like flashing back thinking of all these different. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Now, I mean, some of them do it right. Some of them are really good people, but there's this funny stereotype.
Yeah.
That tends to evolve out of that. Because why? Because there's this fundamental assumption in the New Age that if you ignore the darkness, it'll go away. You don't bring it into your reality, so therefore it doesn't exist for you. Always think positive, don't acknowledge the negative, and it won't exist in your life. Well, you know what? You're denying it consciously, but you're feeding it subconsciously. And that subconsciousness is always going to push it up. It's like having a horrible sewage septic tank problem. You got this nice lawn, but sewage is starting to come up from underneath, despite what you want to plant on the surface.
Right, and like we said earlier, you're still part of the collective, whether you want to be or not. So you can try to ignore the negative that is a part of the collective that you exist in, but it still exists.
Right.
Danger still exists. Criminals still exist. People who want to hurt you still exist. You can try to pretend they don't and ignore it. It's pretend, la, la, la. They still exist. So you have to matter-of-factly face it head on, but do so without fear, matter-of-factly. And you take the physical safety measures to defend yourself or prevent yourself from being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Make smart choices so those things don't happen. But then you also do the metaphysical precautions, getting your vibe raised and do all that stuff too. That's like we touched on at the beginning. You have to do both.
Right, and that's why physical safety and physical preparation, even just for end time stuff, is important. Because you don't have your subconscious fully cleared out yet. I mean, there are parts of your subconscious that are still afflicted by deep wounds that go back to childhood. And no matter how much inner work you do, there's still going to be traces there. And like you just said, Carissa, we're still plugged into the collective. We're still subject to certain physical laws. So what it means is, you can keep your vibes up for a while, but you might be shifting probability maybe only 80% in favor of the positive, but there's this remnant 20%, which essentially means that shit can happen. Mm-hmm. Things can happen by accident or due to negative entities, or maybe due to some unresolved karmic issue, or due to those inner shadow issues that you haven't resolved yet that are pulling it in. It doesn't matter. It can still happen. So, of course, you need some sort of physical safety measure. I mean, that's why we buckle our seatbelts in the car, right? That's why we have to put our hands on the steering wheel and drive. Mm-hmm. You can't simply say, Jesus, take the wheel, and take your hands off and the car drives itself, unless you got automatic co-pilot stuff. But no, obviously we have a certain part in it. But as far as manifesting and vibes go, the problem is a lot of people don't question where their desires come from in the first place. See, a lot of books, they start out with, oh, you've got this wish, you got this desire. Here's a method to fulfill your dreams, to get what you want. And they frame it as like, to get your heart's desire. But of course, everyone thinks that ego, their balls, whatever, that's their heart's desire. Because that's what they've been programmed with. Mm-hmm. They've been grafted upon with these false values by society, by their biology, by their hormones, by, just our evolutionary programming to want certain things that they don't really have real value. They don't actually have real value, but you think that they do. Like for example, we've been programmed by evolution to care for our own physical safety, which is fine, but it can devolve into a grotesque over-exaggeration of that through ego self-preservation, where now, for example, you're a bully. You have to put down other people to boost yourself up so that socially you've got a higher chance of survival. That's like the evolutionary logic behind that. But once you start bullying other people, you're just going to attract more and more problems in your life for karmic reasons and just sheer resonance with that sort of vibe until, one day you're going to get punched in the face and then, which tends to happen. But yeah, so people need to get their priorities straight and to know themselves better. And that can only be done through self-reflection, self-analysis, and getting more and more and more touch with your intuition, your true conscience within. Because it's only by ignoring intuition and ignoring conscience that you can kind of get lost in this fantasy la-la land of the ego and what all the advertisers on TV and the radio and the internet tell you to value, these false value systems that people accept. And it's only by accepting those false values that they then throw their energy into the false things, which lead them further and further away from the light. And then they become increasingly empty until one day, hopefully, they reach rock bottom and they have this, mystical conversion experience where they kind of get back on the path.
An
right?
epiphany.
Yes. Right.
So yeah, lots of important things we just touched on. Another important thing, we've been touching on in all these different ways is subconscious resistance, in the form of the negative programming and limiting beliefs, which often stems from childhood. That really can't be emphasized enough. So much of what we were programmed with or witnessed in childhood is affecting us into adulthood, and it's some heavy duty programming to get past. And a big one, which most of the people who are into the idea of reality creation, because it involves money, again, is that whole poverty programming thing, which we've touched on a few times now, but it is such a big and important one, because money, and it's how we survive in third density. But poverty programming we can get in our childhood, and it creates limitations in our subconscious about what we think is possible for ourselves financially or class-wise, or even what we think we deserve, and it could have been modeled to us by our parents or, just our general circumstances growing up. And I had a recent example at that last job I was at for 7 months. This is such a good example because it just happened and it was so surprising to me. But there was a coworker, I'm going to give her a pseudonym, call her Holly. And, Holly was, anyway, long story short, she had some deliveries of books coming to her at her job. And, so I was giving her the Amazon delivery and I was like, oh, I could tell there's books in there. And she's like, yep. And she was telling me about her books. And I'm like, oh, so are you going to get any cool bookmarks to go with your new books? And her immediate knee-jerk reaction was to look at me with these big eyes and go, I grew up poor. And I'm just like, what? What does that have to do with anything? And I'm just kind of surprised and caught off guard. And I'm just looking at her, keeping in mind she's 41 years old. And she's living in South Florida. She has a nice, well-paying job now. Her own office, which is decorated with all these little trinkets and doodads that cost a lot of money. Expensive electric candles that are scented and all these little fancy nicky-nacky things and pictures on the wall. So she's doing really well for herself now in life, But her immediate reaction when I'm like, oh, you're going to get some bookmarks? I grew up poor. And I'm just very confused, but it really illustrates something. So I just let it go. I didn't even try to question it because I didn't even want to have that conversation. But it just, putting together her personality, this was somebody who, it was almost like for her growing up poor was a badge of honor. This was her identity. And, my kind, we don't get bookmarks. That's rich people stuff, I guess was what she was trying to say. I don't even know. I don't know, because her whole office was all nice and decorated with nice stuff. So it just didn't make sense to me. But she immediately just kind of regressed into this state where, she's back in her childhood in Vermont and she's poor. And, and it just went with everything in general. And this is where I mentioned about the class issue. With the poverty programming, this is somebody who kept herself overweight, covered in tattoos, dressed really sloppy, had a criminal boyfriend. So it was being kind of poor and down on your luck with low-level people that are surrounding you. This was her identity, and she just could not let it go. Even though she was in better circumstances as an adult, there was a huge part of her that was just holding on to all of that and making it a badge of honor and her identity. So, and a lot of other people that I've met, they're kind of wrapped up in that shtick as well. It wasn't just her. I've had multiple people at different jobs over the past few years that I've met who are in that sort of state where they're really latched onto this poverty identity, and they actually keep themselves a wall between them and who they perceive as being someone with money. I don't even want to let you in. I don't want to be friendly with you because look at how you look. You dress nice. You're thin. You don't have tattoos all over your body. You're not one of us. You're not one of the poor people, and it's an identity thing. And they're keeping themselves walled off from other people that they perceive as having money, and therefore keeping themselves walled off from experiences and having a better life in general because they're so latched onto this identity. So this is a repeating pattern. It wasn't just her that I've encountered this with. And it's just unfortunately too common. And so people need to kind of recognize, if they have this sort of subconscious negative programming that's holding you back. And ask yourself, do you truly want to do better and succeed? I mean, I'm sure if I had asked some of these people that I'm just describing right now, they would have said yes. Because on the surface, of course, who wouldn't say yes that you want to do well and succeed? but look at what their actual behaviors were showing. And that knee-jerk programming that just came out of nowhere. I grew up poor. When I was asking if you're going to get a bookmark, no, I was poor when I was a kid 40 years ago in Vermont. It's literally nonsensical. So people will say yes, of course, on the surface, but everything about the way they're behaving and living their life is showing the contrary. It's just showing the opposite. So it shows that they secretly view poverty, suffering, problems, and drama as better. And, in this case, Holly, my coworker, she was also addicted to never-ending personal dramas involving her family. So she was really caught up in that. And again, like I said, she had the criminal boyfriend. She had a problematic relationship with him. So, she was kind of just surrounding herself with ugliness and troubled people and kind of secretly reveling in it. So even though I'm sure she would tell you, of course, she wants to be successful, her job was also stressful. She joked that she was in an abusive relationship with her boss, which was that boss I mentioned earlier, the one that people have described as Satan. And it just gets back to that whole know thyself thing that you were saying, do a self inventory, kind of really look at yourself and know yourself. Are you somebody who actually likes or even thrives on problems and interpersonal dramas? I mean, do you like having a complicated life because it creates the illusion of being busy and that things are happening and life is exciting? I mean, for a lot of people it does. They the negativity creates that illusion that life is exciting. Stuff's happening, and I don't know. And they don't really actually want things to be calm or pleasant and nice. Even if they say they do, they actually don't. So they're their own worst enemies and kind of sabotaging their own existences. And that's why I say, if this is you, to people listening right now, recognize and acknowledge that about yourself, because it is all too common, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing you mentioned is how this person, how she, she surrounded herself with people that were trouble.
Yeah.
Troubled people.
Really negative.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's true that people's own personal reality bubbles, when they come together, they can reinforce each other.
Yes.
Right. It's like the crab mentality. Now these crabs are in a bucket. And one crab tries to crawl out, the other crabs pull it back in.
Mm-hmm.
But that happens not only on a social level, but also on an energetic level, where let's say you live in a house with 4 other people and they're all like depressed goths or whatever, right? I mean, how happy are you going to be within a year from now being around that? Or you're in a particular part of the country or a town that's very poverty and crime ridden. It's going to weigh on you. It's going to be a pressure on your psyche, on your being, on your energy field. And it's going to weigh you down more and more, even if you don't realize it at first. You look back on yourself a couple years later, and you'll realize that you would have been very different had you moved to a different place that had a more positive energy.
Right. And that's, yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the things that was important to me. Like, we live in South Palm Beach County, Florida. It's a very, very nice area. It's kept very nicely landscaped. It sounds all superficial what I'm saying, but it matters. Like when you're surrounded by nice and things look nice and clean and groomed and landscaped and higher end, you're programming your subconscious with niceness all the time. Like, your eyes are always looking around and seeing nice buildings and nice roads and sidewalks and everything's clean and well maintained, and that matters. It's like I've called it, I've refer to it actually as the poverty programming thing. If you live in an ugly area that's run down, you're programming yourself constantly with this ugliness and this poverty stuff. You live in a nice area, you're reinforcing niceness to yourself all the time. So that's one of the things that, maybe people don't realize. The benefits of living in a nicer, richer area is you're going to be reinforcing nicerness, and success to yourself all the time, kind of undoing or canceling out some negative programming you may have had when you were younger. And it's important, what your eyes are looking at every day, and reinforcing beauty and niceness. It really does matter.
Mm-hmm. And the people that you surround yourself with.
Same thing, yeah.
Right, yeah, there's a saying that you are basically essentially a product of the 5 people that you surround yourself with. You're sort of like you average them, and that's sort of the trajectory that you go. So they tell you to be very careful about what 5 people you pick that are closest to you. But, it applies not just to 5, but just the area you live in, the people that you associate with most, whether online or in person.
Type of job you have.
Uh-huh.
And if, like, in Holly's case, reinforce, like, I'm in an abusive relationship with my boss and almost seeming proud of it. And she'd been there 5 years. So she was, like, ingrained in it. Like, again, identity, badge of honor almost. Like, some people actually view, it's like a sick and twisted thing where, like, they have a really negative job that's very stressful and challenging and abusive and toxic, and they have this mistaken idea that if I stick with this and I survive it, it means I'm a better person. Like somehow by quitting and leaving the toxicity, it means you're weak and not a good person. Like it means you're a better, stronger person for tolerating it. I'm like, no, it doesn't. I mean, all it says to me is you've got some serious issues probably stemming back to your childhood. And, you know, you're very comfortable with this abuse. Like, it's because it's probably very familiar to you, unfortunately, from things you may have experienced in your childhood. And that was absolutely the case with Holly. She had a very poor childhood. She was not treated well. There was abuse. There was dysfunction, you know, and so she had like an adult life that was kind of mimicking the criminal boyfriend, the abusive boss at this job that she didn't like, even though it paid well and, you know, she was doing well financially. It wasn't a happy, positive situation for her, but it was like almost like all she knew. And again, a badge of honor, and it's part of her identity. It's just fully ingrained. It's kind of toxic, you know?
Yeah. It's like a self-reinforcing feedback loop in a way.
Yeah.
Because you think that way, and then you attract it, and then you revel in it, and you create more of it. So, and then whatever you attract creates more of that same mindset, you know? So it's this weird reinforcing feedback loop.
And then you actually, like finding you're repelled by the people who are nice.
Right.
The people who look nice and present nice and very pleasant and calm, like, yeah. Like, you're not one of us. You're not, I don't like that.
Yeah. It's almost like a cult. You know, you're in this cult, you're being abused, but you got the Stockholm syndrome that magnetizes you towards it. And on top of that, you've got these false beliefs that shun or shut out anything beyond it. And that's what I mean by self-reinforcing, because you're in it and you've got these mechanisms in place that make you repellent. You know, it repels things that are external to it. So, you know, you could be in a Christian cult, and you'll think that anything that's outside that is the devil, you know, trying to tempt you.
You could be in the vegan cult.
Yeah, or anything.
Yeah.
I mean, reality itself is like a cult in that sense, because we've all been programmed with human biology, with human culture.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we don't necessarily know what's outside this. Yeah. We don't know how much better it can be unless you've got past life memories of another, you know, alien world that you used to live in or something. You remember how much better it could be. But yeah, when people get used to suffering, pain, and darkness, then that's when it becomes an ends in itself. It's no longer a means to an end. It's no longer a means towards spiritual growth, but it becomes an ends in itself. Like, this is what you want. This is your goal. This is what you're familiar with. Yeah. This is what you think that you deserve. Right. You know, so you think you deserve it and you want it, and that's what on a subconscious level energizes it even more and drags more and more of it in. So it becomes this big vortex, like a big tar pit, you know, pulling in more and more animals.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, on a more mundane, positive level, in terms of the poverty programming, I had my own kind of more mundane example of that, where this was years back. Remember, I mentioned the big cheese job earlier that I had, but I started out as a temp at that job, and I was fine with being a temp. I had no designs on wanting to work there permanently. And then, I was there 14 months, and eventually they finally got around to, okay, we need to actually get a permanent person hired for this position. And, I was more than welcome, they said, to be that person, be one of the candidates applying. And at first I was thinking, no, I'm not interested in working here permanent. So there was 2 weeks for where you could apply for this job. That's when the window was for HR. And that entire first week, I was just like, nah, I'm not going to apply. And then, I thought about it. But long story short, just kind of skip forward. I kind of realized I had a limiting idea in my head about how much money I could possibly make in life. And up until that point in life, I'd never had more than $5,000 saved up in my bank account. So ever, at that point. And I was like in my early 30s. So I just got used to that. And I realized I had this programming that's the best I could do in life. I can't go beyond $5,000. So I did this thing where I sat down one night to try to push through this barrier that's literally like almost like a ceiling over my entire being. And the way I did it was I had a piece of paper, a pen, and I envisioned seeing an amount in my bank account that was above 5,000. And I started writing random numbers that were just getting higher and higher and higher, and focusing on those numbers and really feeling it. Like I'm looking at my bank statement or a deposit slip and seeing like 5,101, 5,205 and 5,500, and all of a sudden 6,308, just random numbers that could be a realistic bank account number. and just seeing higher and higher and higher, and just kept writing high until I got past the 10,000 mark, the 15,000 mark, the 20,000 mark. And long story short, that second week, the last final week of the window where you could apply, I decided to go for it. I applied, and I did end up getting it after competing with 9 other candidates. I got the job, and it put me on the big money timeline. And by the time it was all said and done, when we were leaving Charlottesville, after other expenses in life and things, I had at that point almost $33,000. I had 32,000 and whatever, hundreds of dollars change that I'd managed to get to. And because in my opinion, because I did that thing that one night, because I could feel like I seriously cannot envision more than $5,000 ever in my bank account. And then when I could, I got it. So it's all like just a mental block, basically. So that was my own version of poverty programming. It wasn't something that was from my childhood or anything. It was just kind of like, oh, well, I've just never had more than 5,000, so I can't even see myself with more. Like, I can't imagine I could ever have that kind of money. And so I kind of decided I do want to have more than money. I don't want to just only ever have $5,000. You can't. That's not good. You can't survive on that. So I did the efforts, and I guess it wasn't against my personal destiny. It wasn't a black magic thing where I'm trying to force something because it was a viable job. They wanted me to apply for it. I'd already been doing it for 14 months. So it didn't go against anything, and so that, it's my opinion. It all came together. Yeah. It was mine for the taking if I wanted to make it happen is basically what that is. Take matters in your own hands. If you want it, you can have it because this is in your destiny and it's a good, positive thing. And I got it. So.
Yeah, that's a pretty good example of subconscious resistance.
Yeah.
Normally getting in the way of things. Yeah, and it's not just subconscious resistance. It's not just vibes and frequency, but it's also definitely your root assumptions. Mm-hmm. Your root assumptions about what reality is, what life is, like your philosophy of life,
Right.
What's possible for you, especially. It's the things in our psyche that we don't question are the things that end up defining our boundaries, our boundary conditions. That's why it's important to identify some of these limits that shouldn't be there. Because, the $5,000 limit, that is irrational. There's no logical reason why it should be there, right? It's just maybe out of habit. Maybe previously you had never broken through that too much, right?
So I didn't even question that. I just sort of started to accept that was my limit,
Yeah, right. It's like that whole, that metaphor about the elephant, right? The little baby elephant, you tie it to a stick with a little rope, mm-hmm. and it grows up to be a giant elephant, still to the same rope, but it still thinks it can't pull the rope away because it's never been able to,
right?
Even though it's a giant elephant now.
Or you actually take the rope off and it doesn't go anywhere because it's so programmed to not go anywhere.
Yeah.
Even when you set it free, it doesn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the biggest prison isn't physical; it's mental.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So as mentioned at the beginning of this particular section that we're talking about, there's also reality creation that's actually positive intervention that might get mistaken for our own manifestation attempts. But it's where sometimes it's actually something divine, higher, helping us out. So, we might need something, but we're not the ones who made it happen. It was arranged for us by higher stuff looking out for us, making the impossible happen. I know I've had examples of this, and you have too. So I know one of my really good examples happened years ago. It was like maybe, it was 1999 to 2000. And just, long story short, I had an old Nissan Sentra that had a carburetor, and the carburetor conked out, and to get it repaired, it ended up being $260, which I had on hand, but that was going to cut into my share of the rent money that I would be owing. And I don't know why, but I didn't even worry about it. I just kind of had this la sort of attitude about it. Like, somehow I guess I'll just figure it out when rent day comes. I don't know, which wasn't really my normal attitude. My normal attitude is sort of to get stressed out about things. But in this case, I kind of didn't. But I didn't need to stress because, as luck would have it, or divine intervention, my very next paycheck that came in at work, we had bonuses at this particular job. And my particular bonus for that month was exactly $260, the exact same amount that it cost to get my carburetor repaired. So it was like getting reimbursed by reality for this unexpected repair that needed to be done, which I didn't have enough money to cover. And normally our bonuses, this is what was funny, Normally our bonuses were maximum like $50 per person. So this bonus was a mistake. Somehow corporate in New York City, because I was working in Southern California, had screwed up on only my bonus and given me $260. So I remember my then supervisor, her name was Tara, pulled me into the conference room and sat me down to let me know, like, okay, the checks came in, there's bonuses on there, but there's a problem with your bonus. It's like way more than it's supposed to be. It's $260 and it was supposed to be about $50. So she said she'd already contacted corporate and corporate told her, forget it, just let her have it. Don't worry about it. So I got to keep the mistake bonus for $260. So I don't know. I just feel like that was kind of a good example of something maybe higher trying to help me out. And then I know you had a really good example of something like that too.
Yeah, I mean, mine was kind of car related as well, because it was 2011 and I was in a car accident like a week prior. And so I needed to go to Iowa to visit my family, and I figured, hey, while I'm up there, I should probably get a new car at that point, because, you know, that's what I meant earlier in the show when I mentioned my car was conking out. It was like, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't drivable anymore, really.
Yeah.
So it was on its last legs. I figured, okay, I'll just drive up to Iowa if I can, hopefully. I can make it all the way there and then get a car cheaper there. Well, anyway, so I was on the highway taking off, and about 5 minutes later, my hood just flies up in the middle of me driving. And so I went over my windshield, I couldn't see. And of course, you know, I had to step on the brakes and pull over as quickly as possible so I don't like crash into anyone or go off a curve or something.
Yeah.
So I pulled over to the side of the highway, and I got out, pulled the hood back down, and now I needed to figure out, like, how the heck do I keep this hood tied down for the rest of my trip, and I didn't have any rope. So I went to the back of my car, looked around, and I saw my guitar strap. So I took my guitar strap out, I wove it through the hook of the hood and down towards the bumper. But then I didn't have anything to keep that in place because it wasn't long enough to tie. So I needed some sort of a clip or a carabiner or something like that to put it together. I didn't have anything, and time was of the essence because you can't really, it's not safe to stay by the side of the highway with all these cars driving by. So I needed to get off the road.
Right.
I need to get off the side as quickly as possible. And so I was thinking, what can I use? And just then I had a nudge to look down. And I looked down, and I swear, like 2 inches to the right of my right knee that was on the ground, there was this nice, large, R-shaped metal pin, shaped like an R. It was like a giant bobby pin, you know, like a couple inches in size. And so I picked it up, and I hooked it up through my guitar strap and through the lower part of it, and it was perfect, the right size, the right material, and everything. And I put that on there, and sure enough, it worked for the rest of the trip. So the very thing that I needed, which I didn't even know I needed even a minute earlier, because, you know, I didn't know my hood was going to fly up. I thought it was going to be fine. It just happened to be exactly right there, and I still have that little rusty R pin to this day. Just I kept it as a souvenir of this interesting form of serendipity.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and I know manifestation, it's like, it is possible from everything I've heard that you can manifest maybe something on the spot. I mean, I've definitely read accounts of that, but I think that that type of anecdote really is a good, you know, candidate for something that could be, you know, divine intervention or just something higher and positive looking out for you.
Yeah, and it would have to be because in my case, there wasn't enough time between me realizing I needed something and for it to then manifest all of a sudden.
Right. It's just too instantaneous.
Yeah. Now, in your case, like, how long was it between your carburetor conking out and you getting the 260?
Like within less than a week.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And again, it was a mistake. Nobody else got 260. They all got about $50 each, and that was the max we normally ever got. And corporate was just like, it's okay, don't worry, you know, like, you can just let her keep it. So I just kind of feel like that's, you know, something higher was looking out for me. And there's even more weirdness to that story. The fact that when my car did break down, this is another reason I kind of feel that anecdote's a good candidate for higher help, because when my car broke down, it waited until I was already home, literally turning into the garage. And I had my boyfriend, my then boyfriend, Steve, and my best friend, Mike, who is a professional mechanic, with me in the car because we were coming back from hanging out someplace. And the car dies as I'm turning into the garage. So I literally coast into the garage, and it dies as I'm fully home in the garage with two guys with me, one of them whom is a mechanic and could immediately diagnose the problem, gets under the hood, takes a look. So it was just like, you know, I could have gotten stranded on the road and then had even more stuff with tow trucks or AAA or whatever. But no, it helped me get all the way home in the garage. So I just feel like that whole incident, there was definitely something higher trying to help me out.
Mm-hmm.
So, and, I've watched a lot of these videos from Matt Frazier, who's a medium. So, and some people listening to this might be familiar with him. It's literally the best medium I have ever seen. Kind of wrecked me for all other mediums. Don't really even watch any mediums.
Yeah, now that's Matt Frazier, Fraser.
Yeah,
right?
he's got a channel on YouTube with tons of videos of all his readings. So I really highly recommend checking him out. But one of the big things that he's talked about, and this isn't something I ever really realized. Like when I've always thought about higher divine intervention, I'm thinking of things like, angels or maybe your higher self, just something like that. But he's talked about how it can be our own loved ones who've passed onto the other side, who might often be helping us out here and helping us so that our life, works out in our favor, helping opportunities align for us, or even helping to prevent car accidents and things. I mean, those types of things have been said in these readings where he's confirmed that loved ones on the other side are saying that, they recently helped somebody avoid getting in a car accident, and that was confirmed by the person getting the reading. Or they helped with helping to get a new job to fall into place, which was, again, also confirmed by the person getting the reading. So, again, things that we may think we have a hand in manifesting or even attributing to God, angels, Jesus, your higher self, whatever your belief system is, it's actually being facilitated by your own passed on loved ones in some instances. So that's just some interesting food for thought.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting because it makes you wonder, how is it that they're helping us from the other side? And, well, like in my case, this doesn't necessarily help, but it's more of a sign from the other side. I remember recently going for a walk. Well, actually, this was several months ago. And I was thinking, gee, my mom, she died just like the year prior. And I was wondering, how is she doing? Like, is she okay on the other side? Like, what's it like over there? I was just wondering how she's doing. So I walked for several more minutes and I passed by this little public book stand. It's like a little box on poles. People put in their donated books and anyone can
Right.
take any book in there that they want. And actually, I wasn't even going to look at it, but there was this girl that just happened to walk up to it, and she was really like staring into it very intently, like very interested in what was in there. And then she moved on. So because I saw her, I realized, okay, well, maybe there's something interesting in there, and that's why I went to go take a look. And what did I see in there? I saw two books. One was the book Abduction by John Mack. He's an abduction researcher. And that exact book with that exact cover, that particular version, was in this box. And that's the one that back in high school, I was reading all the time, and my mom saw me reading it. So she knew that I love that subject, and I was really into it, and that particular book. Mm-hmm. So that was in there. And then to the right of it, there was another book. I've never heard of this author before, but the title was called Hello from Heaven.
Oh, yeah, I remember this. And I have the book, the abduction book, right next to me on my desk as we're talking. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because I took it.
Yeah. We were.
Yeah,
So.
and the funny thing is that particular book that was in this box, it had this weird orange discoloration on the pages on the outside, which is some sort of a natural fungus or something that old books tend to accumulate it. Mm-hmm. But I've never seen it on any other books, but we had it in our old apartment, some of my books, because we lived in a basement apartment, so it's a little bit humid sometimes.
Yeah.
And so my old abduction copy had that exact same discoloration on it in the same way.
Wow.
Yeah, as this one here.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yep. So that was kind of weird.
Yeah, it is weird.
Yeah, but it makes me wonder, how does that even happen? Because in order for that to happen so soon, it's almost like reality has to be edited. But then I realized, well, wait a minute. The way it happened is pretty much no different from when I intentionally manifest something. It's like this weird synchronistic thing that happens. Like, the book showing up in this box could have been easily similar to like if I were to intend for that particular book. Oh, I need another copy. And then how is it that would come about? It would come about in a synchronistic way, just like this came about. And so I realized, well, what if, our loved ones on the other side have to go through a similar process to send us signs? For example, they do some sort of reality creation intention on their end,
mm-hmm.
Or I guess they can just petition some higher being that has that amount of control and power to go ahead and edit reality and, help us out here. But I remember one of the Matt Fraser videos, the dead was like a dead grandmother or something, or aunt. She said like, I saved you from this one car accident, but I can't keep doing it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that was like this kind of funny moment. Like, yeah, I just say you need to slow down and stop driving like a crazy person. I saved you from this car accident, but I can't keep doing this.
Yeah.
Like there is limits to what they can do.
Right. So either
in terms of intervening for things like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's either some sort of free will law, like, okay, you can do it once, but do it twice or 3 times, and then now it's on you, that sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Or it could be that they only have so much psychic power per unit time over there, so they can't keep doing it constantly. Or, as I just mentioned, they're petitioning some higher being to do it, but then the higher council or whatever says, you can't just keep coming to us and making us fix every little thing.
Right.
Over here.
This person needs to start being an adult and
right.
Take care of their own business. Yeah. You can't keep saving them.
Right. And partly I think it can also be a bit of that plausible deniability where you have to work within that free will and plausibility window where if you save someone once, they can dismiss it as like, okay, maybe it was my dead grandma, but maybe it was just coincidence, right?
Right.
But if it happens like 7 times in a row, now it goes beyond that threshold of believability.
Right.
And I think that's then starts maybe violating free will or violating some sort of rule or law about this reality. Because obviously in this reality, weird stuff happens, but 99% of the time, things are actually quite normal, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, there's rules here, and I think that's why sometimes higher forces, whether it's divine stuff or our loved ones, they need us to intend for something. Like they can't do it themselves anymore, right? I mean, they can do it some of the times, but they can't do it all the times. So sometimes they need us to intend for something. It's almost like they can't really create it themselves in those particular instances. But, they can nudge us to manifest something using our abilities if we choose to do so per our free will. And, I mean, sometimes that also happens in terms of like a big life change that we're about to do or something that's part of our destiny. Interestingly, I noticed things that seem destined don't always automatically happen. It's almost like they could happen and they need to happen, but you're the one that has to give the final go-ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're the one that needs to prompt it or reality create it or kind of like jiggle the handle a little bit to make it, make the penny drop in a way, then they might nudge you to have the compulsion to intend for that. So it's almost like you're opening the door from the inside. Like maybe they can't open it from the outside. So you have to open it from the inside of the matrix. And that's why, and all they can do is say, hey, buddy, unlock the door, let that in.
Yeah.
And so you do it, which can be for good or for bad, because obviously there's negative forces that try to get you to do the exact same thing.
Right. I was just thinking that as you were describing it. Yeah.
Yeah. But, it's not limited to the negative forces because sometimes due to free will laws or karma or maybe obstacles we put in our own path that prevent something necessary from going through, if we're the ones who put the obstacle in that path, then we're the ones that might have to unblock it. Sometimes they have no choice but to kind of subconsciously, intuitively nudge us to do that ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.